What if I told you that one of history's greatest minds believed that playing it safe was actually the most dangerous thing you could do with your life? That comfort zones weren't zones of comfort at all, but prisons that slowly suffocate human potential. This isn't some modern self-help guru talking. This is Aristotle, the man who tutored Alexander the Great, the philosopher whose ideas still shape how we think about ethics, politics, and the very nature of human excellence more than 2,000 years later. Picture this. You're standing at a crossroads. One path is smooth, predictable, safe. The other is rough, uncertain, filled with potential failure. Most people instinctively choose the first path, but Aristotle would have grabbed you by the shoulders and pointed you toward the second one, not because he was reckless, but because he understood something profound about human nature that we've largely forgotten in our modern obsession with security and comfort. Today, we live in a world that worships safety. We have insurance for everything, backup plans for our backup plans, and we've turned risk avoidance into an art form. We celebrate the entrepreneur who never fails, the student who never struggles, the person who climbs the ladder without ever slipping. But what if this entire mindset is not just wrong, but actively harmful to human flourishing? Aristotle had a radical idea. He believed that the very thing we're trying to avoid, failure, is actually the key to unlocking our highest potential. Not just any kind of failure, but the right kind of failure, embraced in the right way, at the right time. This wasn't about being reckless or throwing caution to the wind. This was about understanding that human beings are designed not for safety, but for growth, and growth requires risk. But before we dive into why Aristotle believed this, let me ask you something. When was the last time you truly challenged yourself? When did you last attempt something where failure was not just possible, but probable? If you're struggling to answer that question, you're not alone. And according to Aristotle, you might be missing out on the very essence of what it means to be human. The ancient Greeks had a concept called arete, often translated as virtue or excellence, but it means something much deeper. It's about actualizing your highest potential, becoming the fullest version of yourself. And according to Aristotle, you simply cannot achieve arete by playing it safe. You cannot become excellent by avoiding the very experiences that create excellence. Think about every person you truly admire, the artists whose work moves you, the leaders who inspire you, the innovators who change the world. What do they all have in common? They all failed. They all took risks. They all chose the uncertain path over the safe one. And more importantly, they all learned to see failure not as the opposite of success, but as the raw material from which success is built. This is where Aristotle's philosophy becomes revolutionary. In a world that treats failure as something to be avoided at all costs, he saw it as something to be embraced, understood, and leveraged. But not in the way you might think. Aristotle wasn't advocating for reckless behavior or unnecessary risks. He was advocating for something far more sophisticated: the deliberate cultivation of resilience, wisdom, and character through controlled exposure to difficulty. Let's start with one of Aristotle's most fundamental insights about human nature. He believed that humans are inherently goal-directed beings. We are not designed to simply exist or survive. We are designed to flourish, to actualize our potential, to become something greater than what we currently are. But here's the crucial point. This process of becoming cannot happen in a vacuum. It cannot happen in safety. It requires resistance, challenge, and yes, the possibility of failure. Aristotle wrote, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. But what he understood, and what we often miss, is that excellent habits are forged in the fire of difficulty. You don't develop courage by avoiding scary situations. You don't develop resilience by never facing adversity. You don't develop wisdom by never making mistakes. Consider the physical body for a moment. If you want to build muscle, you have to stress the muscle. You have to create tiny tears in the muscle fiber through resistance training. The muscle doesn't grow during the workout. It grows during the recovery, as it repairs itself and becomes stronger than before. This process requires controlled damage. It requires stress. It requires what could be considered a form of failure at the cellular level. Aristotle understood that the human spirit operates on similar principles. Character, wisdom, courage, and all the virtues he valued most highly are not gifts we're born with. They are muscles that must be developed through use. And just like physical muscles, they require resistance to grow. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of Aristotelian philosophy: his concept of the mean. Many people think Aristotle advocated for moderation in all things, playing it safe, avoiding extremes. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding. The doctrine of the mean isn't about avoiding risk. It's about taking the right risks at the right time for the right reasons. Courage, for Aristotle, is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. But notice what this means. The coward avoids all risk, stays safe, never ventures into uncertainty. The reckless person takes unnecessary risks, courts danger for its own sake. But the courageous person, the virtuous person, deliberately chooses to face appropriate challenges despite the risk of failure. Aristotle said, "Courage is the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees the others." Think about that for a moment. Courage isn't just one virtue among many. It's the foundation upon which all other virtues rest. And courage, by definition, requires the possibility of failure. You cannot be courageous without risking something. You cannot develop courage by playing it safe. This is where modern culture gets it backwards. We think safety leads to happiness and fulfillment. We think avoiding failure is the path to success. But Aristotle understood that this approach leads not to flourishing, but to what he called a life of mere existence. It leads to what we might call today a life of quiet desperation. Let's explore this through Aristotle's famous distinction between different types of happiness. He identified two kinds: hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. Hedonic happiness is pleasure-based, comfort-focused, about feeling good in the moment. Eudaimonic happiness is fulfillment-based, meaning-focused, about living well and actualizing your potential. The safety-first approach to life might deliver hedonic happiness. Avoiding risks, staying comfortable, minimizing stress can indeed make you feel good in the short term, but it comes at the cost of eudaimonic happiness. It comes at the cost of becoming who you're capable of becoming. Aristotle believed that humans are uniquely capable of rational deliberation, of choosing their responses to circumstances, of actively shaping their character through their choices. But this capacity is only actualized through practice, through facing real challenges, through making consequential decisions where the outcome is uncertain. Consider his famous statement, "The roots of education are bitter, but the fruit is sweet." This isn't just about formal education. This is about the fundamental process of human development. Growth is uncomfortable. Learning is difficult. Character development requires facing circumstances that challenge us, that force us to reach beyond our current capabilities. But here's where Aristotle's insight becomes truly profound. He didn't just believe that failure was useful for building character. He believed that the fear of failure was one of the greatest obstacles to human flourishing. He understood that when we organize our lives around avoiding failure, we simultaneously organize our lives around avoiding growth. Think about the opportunities you've declined because they felt too risky, the relationships you've avoided because they might not work out, the career moves you've postponed because they weren't guaranteed, the creative projects you've shelved because they might fail. Each of these decisions, made in the name of safety, is actually a decision against your own development. Aristotle would argue that the person who never risks failure never truly lives. They exist in a kind of suspended animation, maintaining their current state, but never actualizing their potential. They avoid the pain of failure, but they also avoid the joy of authentic achievement. This connects to another crucial aspect of Aristotelian philosophy, his understanding of human agency. Aristotle believed that humans are not passive recipients of whatever life throws at them. We are active agents who can choose how to respond to circumstances. But this agency, this freedom, is only meaningful if our choices have real consequences, if our decisions matter, if we can succeed or fail based on what we do. When we organize our lives around avoiding failure, we're actually diminishing our own agency. We're choosing predictable outcomes over meaningful choices. We're trading our capacity for real achievement for the illusion of security. Aristotle wrote, "It is during our darkest moments that we must focus to see the light." But notice that he's not talking about avoiding dark moments. He's talking about how to navigate them when they inevitably come. He understood that difficulty is not an aberration in human life. It's an essential component of human development. This is radically different from how many people approach challenges today. We often treat difficulties as problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, sources of stress to be eliminated. But Aristotle saw them as opportunities for growth, chances to develop virtues we didn't know we possessed, invitations to become more than we currently are. Let's talk about practical wisdom, or phronesis, one of Aristotle's most important concepts. Practical wisdom is the ability to make good decisions in particular circumstances. It's not theoretical knowledge. It's the kind of understanding that only comes from experience, from trial and error, from facing real situations with real consequences. But here's the key insight. You cannot develop practical wisdom without making mistakes. You cannot learn to make good decisions without making some bad ones. You cannot develop judgment without exercising judgment in situations where you might be wrong. This is why Aristotle believed that young people, no matter how intelligent or well-educated, cannot possess practical wisdom, not because they lack the intellectual capacity, but because they lack the experience. They haven't had enough opportunities to fail, to learn from their mistakes, to develop the pattern recognition that comes only from navigating complex, uncertain situations. Don't think about this in the context of modern educational systems that often prioritize getting the right answer over learning from the wrong ones, or corporate cultures that punish failure rather than treating it as a learning opportunity. These approaches, however well-intentioned, actually impede the development of practical wisdom. They create people who are technically competent, but practically ineffective. Aristotle understood that wisdom is not just about knowing what to do in theory. It's about knowing what to do in the messy, complex, uncertain situations that make up real life. And this kind of knowing can only be developed through practice, through making real decisions with real stakes, through failing and learning and trying again. This brings us to another crucial point: Aristotle's understanding of the relationship between risk and reward. In modern financial theory, we talk about the risk-return trade-off. Higher potential returns require accepting higher levels of risk. But Aristotle applied this principle much more broadly. He understood that the things we value most highly in life, the deepest forms of satisfaction and meaning, require accepting uncertainty and the possibility of failure. Love is risky. You might get hurt. You might be rejected. You might invest yourself in someone who doesn't reciprocate your feelings. But the alternative to risking heartbreak is never experiencing deep connection. The alternative to vulnerable intimacy is emotional isolation. Pursuing your calling is risky. You might not be as talented as you hoped. You might struggle financially. You might face criticism or rejection. But the alternative to risking professional failure is never. Discovering what you're truly capable of achieving. Standing up for what you believe is risky. You might face opposition. You might be wrong. You might face social consequences for your convictions. But the alternative to risking moral failure is never developing authentic integrity. Aristotle saw this pattern everywhere. The things that make life worth living require us to risk the very security that modern culture tells us to prioritize above all else. But Aristotle wasn't naive about risk. He didn't advocate for foolish chances or unnecessary dangers. His approach was much more sophisticated. He believed in what we might call intelligent risk-taking, carefully considered decisions to accept uncertainty in service of worthy goals. This is where his concept of deliberation becomes crucial. Aristotle believed that excellent decision-making requires careful consideration of our goals, our circumstances, and our options. But once we've done that analysis, once we've deliberated carefully, we must be willing to act despite uncertainty. We must be willing to fail. He said, "Well begun is half done." But notice what he's emphasizing here. It's not perfect execution. It's beginning. It's taking the first step, despite not knowing exactly where the path will lead. It's choosing action over analysis paralysis. This connects to one of the most practical aspects of Aristotelian philosophy: his understanding that excellence is developed through practice, not perfection. He didn't expect anyone to be virtuous immediately. He expected people to practice virtue, to attempt excellence, to fail and learn and try again. Consider his famous metaphor of the archer. A skilled archer doesn't hit the bullseye every time, but they aim for it every time. They practice consistently. They learn from their misses. They adjust their technique. They develop their skill through repeated attempts, many of which fall short of the target. This is how Aristotle viewed character development. You don't become virtuous by achieving perfect virtue immediately. You become virtuous by consistently aiming for virtue, by practicing virtuous behavior, by learning from your moral failures and recommitting to your highest ideals. But this process is impossible if you're unwilling to risk moral failure. If you only act when you're certain you'll be virtuous, you'll never act at all. If you only take stands when you're sure you're right, you'll never develop moral courage. If you only love when you're guaranteed not to be hurt, you'll never experience authentic intimacy. Aristotle understood that the virtues are like skills. They must be practiced to be developed, and practice necessarily involves imperfect performance, mistakes, failures, and gradual improvement. The person who demands perfection from themselves never gives themselves the chance to practice. The person who won't risk failure never gives themselves the chance to succeed. This brings us to one of the most counterintuitive aspects of Aristotelian philosophy: his belief that happiness is not a feeling but an activity. We often think of happiness as something that happens to us, something we experience, something we feel. But Aristotle defined happiness as the activity of living excellently, of actualizing our highest potential. This means that happiness is not something you achieve and then possess. It's something you do. It's an ongoing practice of excellent living. And excellent living necessarily involves taking appropriate risks, facing challenges, and accepting the possibility of failure. Think about the people in your life who seem most genuinely fulfilled. Are they the ones who've avoided all risk and challenge? Or are they the ones who've faced difficulties head-on, who've grown through adversity, who've developed strength and wisdom through experience? Aristotle would predict that the most satisfied people are not those who've lived the safest lives, but those who've lived the most fully realized lives, those who've actualized their potential despite, or perhaps because of, the risks they've taken and the failures they've endured. This connects to his understanding of human nature as essentially dynamic. Aristotle didn't see humans as static beings who achieve a certain state and then maintain it. He saw us as beings whose nature is to grow, to develop, to become. And this process of becoming never ends. It requires constant engagement with new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new risks. The safety-first approach to life assumes that there's a point at which we can stop growing, stop challenging ourselves, stop taking risks. It assumes that we can achieve security and then simply enjoy it. But Aristotle understood that this approach leads not to lasting satisfaction, but to stagnation. He believed that human beings have what we might call a growth imperative. We're designed to develop, to actualize our potential, to become more than we currently are. When we resist this imperative in the name of safety, we're working against our own nature. We're choosing a kind of slow death over vibrant life. This is why Aristotle placed such emphasis on excellence as a habit rather than an achievement. Excellence is not something you attain once and then possess forever. It's something you practice daily through your choices, your responses to challenges, your willingness to grow and learn and risk and fail and try again. Consider his observation that we become just by doing just actions, temperate by doing temperate actions, brave by doing brave actions. Notice that he's talking about doing, not being. He's talking about practice, not perfection. He's talking about repeated attempts to embody our ideals, knowing that we'll sometimes fall short, but committing to the process. Anyway, this is radically different from perfectionist approaches that demand flawless performance. It's also different from relativistic approaches that avoid making any demanding commitments. Aristotle charted a middle course: high standards coupled with patient practice, lofty ideals coupled with gracious acknowledgement of our humanity. But this middle course is not a safe course. It requires us to commit to standards that we might not meet. It requires us to aim for targets we might miss. It requires us to risk the disappointment of falling short of our own ideals. Aristotle also understood something else that's often missed in discussions of risk and safety: the relationship between individual flourishing and contribution to community. He didn't see personal development as a purely private matter. He understood that we develop our highest capacities, partly in order to serve something larger than ourselves. This means that playing it safe doesn't just harm us individually. It deprives our communities of the contributions we might make if we fully actualized our potential. When we choose security over growth, we're not just limiting ourselves. We're limiting our capacity to serve others, to solve problems, to create value, to make the world better. Think about the innovations that have improved human life, the scientific discoveries, the artistic creations, the social reforms, the entrepreneurial ventures that have expanded human possibilities. None of these emerged from people playing it safe. They all required someone to risk failure in the service of something they believed was worth pursuing. Aristotle would argue that we have an obligation not just to ourselves, but to our communities to develop our capacities as fully as possible. And this development necessarily requires risk, challenge, and the possibility of failure. As we wrap up this exploration of Aristotelian philosophy, let's consider what it means for how we live our lives today. If Aristotle was right, if failure really is better than safety, what does that imply for our choices, our priorities, our approach to the challenges we face? First, it suggests that we need to fundamentally reframe our relationship with failure. Instead of seeing failure as the opposite of success, we need to see it as the raw material from which success is built. Instead of organizing our lives around avoiding failure, we need to organize our lives around learning from it. Second, it suggests that we need to actively seek appropriate challenges, not reckless risks, but thoughtful opportunities to grow, to test ourselves, to develop capacities we didn't know we possessed. This might mean pursuing opportunities that excite and scare us in equal measure. Third, it suggests that we need to cultivate what we might call a growth orientation rather than a safety orientation. Instead of asking, how can I avoid failure? We need to ask, how can I learn and grow from whatever happens? Fourth, it suggests that we need to practice courage as deliberately as we might practice any other skill. We need to gradually expand our comfort zones, taking on challenges that require us to be braver than we've been before. Finally, it suggests that we need to remember that the goal is not to avoid all risk, but to take the right risks for the right reasons. The goal is not to never fail, but to fail well, to learn from our failures, to use them as stepping stones toward wisdom and excellence. Aristotle believed that humans are capable of extraordinary things, but he also believed that these capabilities can only be actualized through facing extraordinary challenges. He believed that we are designed not for safety, but for growth, not for comfort, but for excellence, not for avoiding failure, but for transcending it, in a world that increasingly prioritizes security over growth, comfort over challenge, and safety over actualization. Aristotle's philosophy offers a radically different vision of human flourishing. It's a vision that honors both our fragility and our strength, both our need for security and our need for growth. The question is not whether you'll face challenges and setbacks in your life. You will. The question is whether you'll see them as obstacles to be avoided or as opportunities to be embraced. Whether you'll organize your life around avoiding failure or around growing through it. Aristotle would tell you that the choice you make will determine not just what you achieve, but who you become. And ultimately, who you become is more important than what you achieve, because it's who you become that determines the quality of your experience, the depth of your relationships, and the meaning of your life. The safe path might seem appealing, but it leads to a destination you probably don't want to reach. A life of unrealized potential, unexplored possibilities, and unanswered questions about what you might have been capable of if only you'd been brave enough to find out. The risky path is harder, uncertain, sometimes painful, but it leads somewhere worth going, toward the fullest expression of your humanity, toward the deepest forms of satisfaction, toward a life lived with integrity and courage and wisdom earned through experience. Aristotle made his choice. He chose the examined life over the comfortable life, the challenging path over the safe path, the possibility of failure over the guarantee of mediocrity. The question now is, what will you choose?